On the day of shooting this video, we are seeing what the new magnified intelligence community is including in the annual worldwide threat assessment. Last year's report included, for instance, the activities of Russia and the impact of climate change. The question raised in the last few days was whether these would appear again in this year's report, in spite of the fact that President Trump possibly maybe doesn't want to hear about them. From the initial presentation of Tulsi Gabbard to the Intelligence Committee, it seems that Russia does feature. No mention of climate change, maybe it's in a footnote. Now, it seems they may need to recall and redo the report completely anyway, because I'm fairly sure it won't include any major threat attributed to blundering amateurs appointed to the top of government who give away highly classified military secrets to journalists, kind of by accident. This, of course, is the story that has been dropping jaws across the world of the group chat on the app Signal, including Vice President J.D. Vance, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, and a bunch of others. And inadvertently, because Mike Waltz added him, the editor of The Atlantic magazine. MAGA-friendly news sources have been somewhat downplaying this, but for everyone else it is something that they vaguely remember would have been a huge deal under any other previous administration. Now, the highlight that got the most attention was Pete Hegseth sharing detailed war plans for a coming military strike against the Yemeni Houthis. The sort of detail that could have seriously compromised the lives of the American military and affected the outcome of a major action, had it gotten into the wrong hands. The other highlight that caught the attention was J.D. Vance being a sweet and respectful kind of guy. I'm kidding. J.D. Vance was ranting about European nations being a bunch of pathetic freeloaders, and this was getting his goat, because keeping these waterways open would benefit European shipping more than it would benefit American shipping. So they were going to have to make sure to get some sort of recompense from the Europeans for this service, and demand that they say thank you repeatedly. I expect that last part wasn't spelled out in the actual texts, but we know it's coming. J.D. Vance's contempt for Europe seemed to be at the heart of his stated opposition to the plan, and indeed disagreement with Trump's policy generally. He texted this: "I am not sure the president is aware how inconsistent this is with his message on Europe right now," he said. This is a bit odd, since the primary reason why Trump would care about this is that the Houthis are an Iranian proxy, and pushing back on their activity to disrupt shipping is more about pegging the Iranian regime with its nuclear ambitions, something that Trump certainly seemed to see, and one would suggest correctly so, as a direct American interest. Maybe Vance just didn't get the memo. The tone of that discussion generally came across as puerile and unserious. The successful completion of a bombing raid was met with a series of celebratory emojis. All it needed was an LOL or two. When it came to light that it had been shared with a journalist, a White House official said that it was, quote, a demonstration of the deep and thoughtful policy coordination between senior officials. Really, yet more words that have been substantially redefined in the Trump-era approved dictionary. What Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth did when he was told about what had happened on screen was to deny everything and say rude things about the editor of The Atlantic. He called Jeffrey Goldberg a so-called journalist and added authoritatively, "Nobody was texting war plans, and that's all I have to say about that." Presumably he wasn't aware at the time that the White House had already confirmed that the message threat was actually authentic.
Under the previous administration, we looked like fools. Not anymore.
When Trump selected his top team and pushed them through confirmation, it was of course a major focus of discussion, not least on this channel, that going for loyalty over competence and credentials would probably come back to bite the administration at some point in the future. Well, it's not a huge surprise that it happened this quickly. It's more luck that Trump deserves that it did so in a way that didn't result in major real-world consequences, at least not this time. By putting this sort of highly classified discussion onto a public app, presumably on their own phones, they all committed what, in normal times, would be held to be grossly and indeed criminally negligent. Indeed, in any other time, the Independent Department of Justice would be opening an investigation into this. Well, so far, and it's early days, but the initial response is often most telling, so far there has been minimal public contrition. And the realization amongst all of us observing how this administration is playing out, the fact that the Justice Department and the FBI is now loaded with loyalists, and the head of security services, Tulsi Gabbard, was also among those included on the group chat, leads to a sense of impunity as a first response. Now, it is so bad, that sense of impunity may not have the last word even for this administration. For one thing, Donald Trump wasn't on the chat himself, so he can at least distance himself from it and blame others sometime in the future, should he choose to do so. For another, as the implications of this have been sinking in across Congress, it's clear there's going to be some determined backlash to this happening. So Mike Waltz, the security advisor, his job has to be in the balance right now, because he was the one who added the journalist. A momentary lapse of concentration, adding someone with the same initials as the person he meant to add, all very understandable, except of course, if they weren't using the Signal app on their own phones, if they were using proper and secure channels, such a slip of a finger wouldn't have even been possible, which of course is exactly why such channels exist. So there's really no excuse for anyone who was in the group, since they were all supposed to know better. The other one who might be most at risk will be Hegseth, who after all chose to paste in actual operational details on the forthcoming military action. None of it should have been on Signal at all, but that stuff definitely should never have been placed there. These are the people, remember, whose first priority was weeding out DEI practices in their agents in the name of merit-based appointments only. Now, personally, I'm a big fan of a principle. Merit should be the top criteria for highly important posts in government and the military. You could hardly have more graphically had it demonstrated how little merit versus, say, personal loyalty to Donald J. Trump there has been in the top-level appointments that put these people into cabinet positions in the first place. And that loyalty still counts to all appearances. Trump told NBC News that this was all just a glitch, and not a serious one. And Mike Waltz had learned a lesson. So, that's all right then. Or, alternatively, we might all, the rest of us, be right in saying that this is a clown show. When it comes to the potential for authoritarian takeover of government, I suppose that's quite reassuring, because if you have to put authoritarians in charge, you'd probably prefer incompetent ones to the alternative. But in terms of keeping your nation safe and secure, yeah, not so much. Because look, this may be the most serious breach so far, but it's certainly not the first, and we're only a couple of months in, remember. We've already seen Trump appointing a real estate buddy to be his negotiating piece in Ukraine. One reason why, in an interview with Tucker Carlson at the weekend, he was heard to be repeating almost verbatim Russian propaganda talking points, such as Ukraine not being a real country, and Russian-controlled parts of Ukraine having held totally legit referenda showing that the majority of people there actually desperately want to be Russian. At least, they do when you're pointing a gun at them. although he didn't mention that bit. Hour to hour, Vladimir Putin can't believe his luck. Then there's the bold action the Trump team took to release unredacted all the information about the JFK assassination. Promise made, promise kept. Except, oops, it included the social security numbers of former government officials. And add to that the sending of the names of recently hired CIA agents in an unclassified email to the White House. And then add to that the Doge purge of federal employees, apparently carried out in a state of total ignorance of what those employees actually did, and then a panicked attempt to rehire some of them when it turned out that they were actually responsible for fairly important things like, nuclear weapons. Add to that the anti-DEI purge of the Pentagon, scrubbing any web pages that a drunken AI bot with dementia decided might be even slightly woke, including pictures of a plane that dropped the first atomic bomb because it had the word gay in the title. Add to that the report that Elon Musk, with his major Chinese business interests, was to be given a briefing on China at the Pentagon. A news report that was angrily denied and called fake news by Trump and by Musk, but then the Pentagon launched an investigation into the leak. So, was it a leak or was it a lie? Surely you get to choose only one. Now that's a matter for American citizens to ponder, along with the question, what does the acronym DEI stand for anymore? Because if it's drunk, entitled and ignorant, then they might have to do a bit more purging. But for European leaders, they have focused, unsurprisingly, on the vision of J.D. Vance, once again showing himself to be the most confrontational and hostile towards what used to be described as the transatlantic alliance. This, of course, is not just the vision of Vance, as we heard from Trump's buddy Witkoff in his Tucker Carlson interview, where he said that the Gulf economies, quote, "It could be much bigger than Europe. Europe is dysfunctional today." To which Putin's other mate, Tucker Carlson, added, "It would be good for the world because Europe is dying." Former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt noted that the text exchange showed J.D. Vance as, quote, "driven by deep anti-European resentment." Now, we didn't exactly need a leak of texts for Europe to know that it's held in contempt by J.D. Vance and certain other members of the administration, such as Pete Hegseth. What they will be grappling with afresh from this episode is the question of how much do they dare to share with the Americans in the future in terms of their own intelligence gathering. Now, this was a question they were already asking because, of course, Trump had placed a Putin supporter as the head of the security services, which some found relatively controversial at the time, and then turned out to be the Putin supporter-in-chief himself, did Mr. Trump, at least for the last month. Who knows what he'll be doing in next month? Now it's a question with renewed vigour. Today, the UK Prime Minister said that there was no question of not sharing intelligence with our valued partners, the Americans. Whether he was actually telling the truth, well, that's probably classified. But it certainly can't be taken for granted, because while the remaining US intelligence agents that haven't yet been fired may be lions, they are most assuredly led by donkeys. Now, as previously mentioned, some of those donkeys are on show today. We are seeing the latest worldwide threats assessment. The report hadn't yet been published, but almost literally as I'm shooting this video, Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence, and John Ratcliffe, the CIA Director, and Kash Patel, the FBI Director, have been testifying about all of this to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Since both of the first two were on the now famous chat signal group, it was fascinating to see some of the questions they got asked to answer on the whole affair and how determinedly they sought to avoid answering any of them. But those questions are not going to get away. They are likely to gather steam over the next few days and maybe the coming weeks. And what the final answers are going to be could be a lot more serious for all involved than they currently hoping will prove to be the case.